Being born an identical twin is like growing up in a house filled with mirrors. Everywhere you look, you see yourself, yet never quite know if the reflection is telling the truth. For as long as I can remember, I shared everything with my sister, Isla Donovan. We entered the world just 2 minutes apart, both of us screaming into the December cold as a snowstorm buried our family's New England estate in silence. It was poetic in a way. Two daughters born to privilege and legacy, surrounded by wealth, walled gardens, and ancestral expectations. From the outside, Isla and I were indistinguishable. Our matching chestnut hair fell in the same glossy waves. Our sea glass eyes mirrored each other so perfectly that even our mother mixed us up well into our teens. We had the same laugh, the same smile, and the same sharp cheekbones that everyone in the Donovan bloodline seemed to inherit along with their trust funds. But while our faces were mirror images, our souls were born into different worlds. Isla was light on her feet, magnetic, dazzling in a way that seemed effortless. She was the kind of child who would charm strangers in the grocery store and win spelling bees without studying. People gravitated to her like she carried a gravitational pull, and she learned early how to use it. By the time we were 16, she was already mapping out her future in business and international finance, casually dropping the names of Ivy League schools into conversations like they were family friends. I, on the other hand, was quieter. I felt most at home with a brush in my hand or my nose tucked between the pages of a novel. I loved to observe more than to perform, to listen rather than to interrupt. Our family, rooted in tradition, in legacy, in appearances, never quite knew what to do with that side of me. My mother encouraged me to be more like Isla. My father, ever the stoic patriarch, barely registered my existence once he realized I had no interest in corporate strategy or capital returns. The only person who saw me, really saw me, was our grandmother, Eleanor Donovan. Eleanor was a legend in our town. A widow by the age of 40, she turned the family estate into both a sanctuary and a symbol of quiet power. She was an art historian, a collector of forgotten stories, and the founder of 3 different charities that empowered women across the state. When the rest of the world tried to push me into Ila's shadow, Eleanor opened the garden gate and let me bloom on my own. Every Sunday, without fail, she invited me to tea in her sunroom. The first time I was 7, my knees knocking as I sat at her carved oak table, a china cup trembling in my hands. She poured me a cup of chamomile and said, "This is our time, Ava. Yours and mine. No masks, no comparisons." It became our tradition. Isla was always too busy. Ballet, fencing, debate club, brunches with her elite friends. That was fine. I liked having Eleanor to myself. She taught me about art, real art, not the kind hanging in gilded frames at the Met, but the kind etched into everyday life. She taught me how to see color in silence, how to find rhythm in stillness, how to paint a rose that didn't just look real but felt alive. But she didn't stop at paint. Between sips of tea and careful brushstrokes, Eleanor taught me the unspoken history of our family, the women who were erased from the Donovan lineage, the land deals lost to greed, the secrets she feared would die with her if someone didn't carry them forward. She taught me that money was only as good as what it was used for, and that power without purpose was a kind of rot. I didn't realize it at the time, but those Sundays were more than tea and lessons. They were preparation. While Isla climbed her ladder, valedictorian, Wharton School of Business, junior VP at a billion-dollar hedge fund by 29, I built a quieter life. I earned a fine arts degree and opened a modest studio in Providence, teaching painting to kids from underfunded schools and curating small exhibitions for local artists. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make headlines. But it was mine. Every few months, Eleanor would visit, slipping in quietly through the back entrance, her silver scarf tied tight against the wind. She'd sit in the corner of the studio, watch me work, and sometimes offer a simple, "I'm proud of you." Wow. Those words meant more than anything I'd ever achieved. We never talked about Isla during those visits. I think we both knew there was a wall there neither of us could scale. Despite our differences, I never hated Isla. I envied her sometimes for her ease in the world, her ability to bend people to her will. But mostly I pitied her, for what she had to abandon to become who she was. Isla saw life as a game. You either played to win or you lost. I lived by a different code, one Eleanor had passed down to me like an heirloom. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be true. That truth unraveled one chilly October afternoon. It was a regular day at the studio. I had just finished helping a 10-year-old student clean her brushes when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I remember the way her voice sounded. Tight, restrained, like she was holding back something fragile. "It's Grandma," she said. "There's been an accident." I don't remember dropping the phone, but I do remember the sound it made when it hit the floor. The world blurred after that. The next few hours were a montage of chaos. Canceling classes, packing a bag, forgetting where I'd left my car keys, crying silently on the drive back to the Donovan estate, watching the autumn leaves blur into orange and gold streaks through the windshield. I arrived just after sunset. The estate stood solemn against the horizon, its white pillars shadowed by clouds. Inside, the house buzzed with relatives. Some I hadn't seen in years, others I barely remembered. They whispered in the hallways, clutched wine glasses with trembling fingers, speculated quietly about the funeral and, inevitably, the inheritance. Everyone loved Eleanor, but they also knew what she was worth. I wandered through the familiar rooms in a daze. Everything smelled like her. Roses, vanilla, something warm and citrusy. But she was gone. Her laugh no longer echoed down the halls. Her presence, once so strong it filled the air like music, had vanished. I ended up in her library, my favorite place in the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books, oil paintings that shifted in mood with the light, and always the fireplace crackling with stories. I curled up in the same chair I'd always used during our Sunday teas. The silence settled around me like a second skin. That's when the door creaked open. "She's not here, you know." I turned to see Isla standing in the doorway, a suitcase in one hand, designer coat perfectly tailored. Her face was flawless, no trace of grief. "I know," I said. "You're late." She smiled, cold and polished. "Business, you understand." I didn't, and she knew it. She crossed the room, glancing around like she was inspecting merchandise. "So, has the will been read yet?" "No," I said. "Tomorrow." "Good," she said, setting her bag down on Eleanor's antique writing desk. "Then we have time." "For what?" But she didn't answer. She simply looked at the portrait of Eleanor above the fireplace and said, "I always thought she'd leave this place to me." Something in her voice made me sit up straighter. There was no warmth in it, no sentiment, just calculation. That night, as I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something I had never fully admitted to myself before. Isla may have shared my face, but we had never shared the same heart. Some twins grow apart. Others were never truly connected to begin with. And that was the night I started to wonder if the mirror I had grown up looking into had all along been hiding a stranger. And if that stranger was willing to go further than I ever thought possible. Because the more I thought about it, the sudden accident, her rushed return, her questions about the will, one terrifying possibility began to take shape. What if Eleanor hadn't died by chance? What if someone had helped make sure she wouldn't live long enough to speak for herself? I didn't want to believe it, but I also couldn't ignore the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And I was about to find out just how far Isla Donovan was willing to go for an inheritance, and how far I'd have to go to stop her. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of my grandmother's room like a memory you could almost touch. Warm, familiar, and haunting. I had slept little the night before, if you could call it sleep at all. My thoughts twisted through the hours in looping spirals. Eleanor's laugh echoing in the hallways, the last brushstroke we painted together, and Isla's strange, hollow question in the library. Has the will been read yet? It was the kind of question that didn't belong to grief. The house was unusually still that morning. The once bustling Donovan estate, usually filled with the gentle sounds of footsteps over wood floors and distant music from Eleanor's radio, felt vacant. Even the usual scent of roses seemed to have faded. There was something in the air that pressed against my chest like an invisible weight. Downstairs, the staff were setting up for the reading of the will. My family was already gathering in the drawing room, dressed in black but cloaked in something colder than mourning. Anticipation. There were soft voices and sideways glances. My Uncle Jeffrey whispered something about stock portfolios. Aunt Lucille already seemed to be mentally rearranging furniture. No one mentioned Eleanor's art collection, but I saw the way their eyes lingered on certain canvases, as if mentally tagging them. When I entered, Isla was already seated in the center of the room, like a queen waiting for her coronation. Her black dress was sleek, her posture composed. She tapped one polished nail against her coffee cup, the sound sharp and rhythmic, like a countdown. Mr. Murray Carter, our family's longtime attorney and one of the few people I believed Eleanor truly trusted, stood by the fireplace with a briefcase in hand. His face was drawn, as if the weight of what he carried had taken a physical toll. He cleared his throat and gestured for everyone to settle in. "I want to begin by offering my deepest condolences," he said. Eleanor Donovan was not just a client. She was a friend, a mentor, and a remarkable woman. There were murmurs of agreement. I saw Isla's eyes flick toward the door. Then she stood. "Before you proceed," she said, reaching into her handbag, "there's something you need to see." She handed a thick envelope to Mr. Carter, who accepted it with a frown. His eyes scanned the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. After a long pause, he looked up. "This appears to be a more recent version of Eleanor's will," he said slowly. "Dated 2 weeks ago." There was a collective intake of breath. The air shifted. I stared at the envelope, at the way Isla's fingers had lingered on it a moment too long. Something inside me buckled. "She gave it to me for safekeeping," Isla said smoothly. "Said she wanted to avoid any confusion." Confusion? The word felt like an insult. Mr. Carter adjusted his glasses, reviewing the signatures. "This is highly irregular. Eleanor and I drafted a final version 6 months ago. She never mentioned—" She changed her mind. Isla interrupted. She said she didn't want sentimentality getting in the way of practicality. I stood up. That doesn't sound like her. Isla's eyes locked onto mine with a calm that felt almost inhuman. "You were always her favorite, Ava. Maybe she realized it clouded her judgment." Mr. Carter opened his briefcase and pulled out the version I had seen Eleanor sign months ago. The will we had discussed over tea, folded neatly between antique bookmarks and inked in her handwriting. "She told me she was happy with this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But this," Isla said, pointing to the new document, "is what she actually signed last." Mr. Carter hesitated. "According to this version, the entire estate, including all monetary assets, the Donovan house, and the art collection, is to be left to Isla Donovan." Silence. Aunt Lucille's teacup clinked against its saucer. My uncle shifted in his seat. I could feel their thoughts. "She won." Of course she did. Isla always wins. I stepped closer to Mr. Carter, asking quietly, "May I see it?" He handed me the will, and I scanned it line by line. Everything looked legal. The language, the format. It mirrored what Eleanor would have used. The signature at the bottom was fluid, familiar, too familiar. My heart stopped. The E, the loop, the exact slant on the D in Donovan. It wasn't Eleanor's handwriting. It was mine. My breath caught in my throat. The ground felt like it shifted beneath me. I remembered signing something months ago, a check for art supplies, a gallery agreement, maybe even a birthday card. We had always been warned growing up. Our handwriting was too similar. Teachers had confused our tests. Bank clerks had asked twice. But I had always been careful. I never thought— "You forged this," I whispered. Isla's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "This isn't Grandma's signature," I said, louder now. "It's mine, or at least it's a copy of mine. That's a serious accusation, Ava," Mr. Carter said cautiously. "Do you have proof?" Isla added, calm as ever. I stared at her, wondering how she'd gotten a sample of my signature so perfect, wondering how long she'd been planning this. The woman in front of me wore my face, my features, but her smile was that of a stranger. Mr. Carter looked from one of us to the other. If this will is legally verified, and no other recent document exists, I must honor its terms. Isla stood, already smoothing the front of her dress. Then I assume we're done here. I stepped in front of her. This isn't over. She tilted her head. It is if you can't prove anything. And with that, she left the room. The family followed, slowly, murmuring, their curiosity already fading back into apathy. Mr. Carter remained behind, looking at the two wills as if hoping one would vanish. I returned to the library and stood before the fireplace, staring at Eleanor's portrait. The eyes that had once lit up with wisdom and mischief seemed to stare down at me in silence now. I whispered, "You wouldn't have done this." I needed air. I stepped outside, walked through the garden paths that wound behind the estate. Eleanor's roses were beginning to wilt. The wind bit through my coat, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of wheels crunching gravel. It was Isla, loading her things into a sleek black car, giving directions to a moving team. She was claiming the house already, claiming our grandmother's legacy. And there was nothing I could do to stop her, yet. Back inside, I wandered aimlessly until I found myself in Eleanor's bedroom. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her shawl still draped across the chaise lounge, her reading glasses on the side table. I sat on her bed, unsure if I was trespassing or coming home. Then, a voice. "Ava?" I turned to see Agnes, the housekeeper who had served our family for over 20 years. Her hands were twisted with arthritis, her eyes red. I thought you should know," she said, hesitating in the doorway. "Your grandmother. She was upset the day before the accident. Distracted. I found her crying. Something about your sister. About the charity books." I stood. "Did she say anything else?" Agnes reached into her apron and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "She told me to give you this, if anything ever happened to her. She said you'd know what to do." My hands trembled as I opened the notebook. Inside was Eleanor's handwriting, undeniably hers, page after page of thoughts, memories, and records. The final entry was dated just one day before her accident. "Called Marcus about Isla's activities at the Sterling Foundation. Money missing. Offshore accounts. I can't believe it. I need to fix this. Ava deserves the truth." The entry ended abruptly. There was one last line written in rushed ink. "Tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. I closed the notebook, my heart pounding with both grief and rising rage. This was no longer just about inheritance. This was about justice. And the only way forward was to find out what Eleanor had been trying to reveal, and expose what Isla had done before she buried the truth beneath a forged name. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The morning after the reading of the forged will, I woke in a house that no longer felt like home. The Donovan estate, once filled with music, fragrance, and stories, now felt hollow. Every room carried the heavy hush of absence, and each step I took echoed louder than the last, like a reminder of what had been lost. Not just Eleanor, but the very soul of this place. I stood for a long time at the threshold of the library, the same room where my grandmother and I had once spent hours drinking tea and speaking about the things no one else cared to remember. The family's origins, lost heirlooms, the truth buried beneath layers of tradition. And I remembered something she'd said to me one rainy afternoon, only weeks before her death, as she gently cleaned the painting of roses above the fireplace. "Some art," she said softly, "is more than paint and canvas. Some art holds secrets worth protecting." At the time, I thought she was being poetic. I had no idea she meant it quite literally. Later that day, I gathered the courage to call two people I trusted more than anyone outside my grandmother. The first was Grace, a dear friend from art school who now worked as an art authenticator and historian at a prominent Boston museum. Grace had a mind like a razor and the kind of patience that only came from years of examining minute brushstrokes for signs of forgery. She was also the only person I knew who might be able to validate my suspicion about the signature on the will, that it was mine, not Eleanor's. The second was Lucian Shaw, an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering corruption in high places. Lucian and I had met years ago during a fundraiser at my gallery. He had been drawn to one of my exhibits about forgotten women in history, and we'd stayed in touch ever since. He knew how to read between lines, to track whispers through bureaucratic mazes, and to make truth impossible to ignore. When I explained the situation to both of them, neither hesitated. "I'm coming tonight," Grace said. "Bring the will and any samples of your signature." "I'll dig into Isla's finances," Lucian promised. "If there's something to find, I'll find it." As dusk fell over the estate, I wandered back into the library. The painting of roses caught my eye again. It had always been there, framed in a thick gilt border, a vivid burst of life in a room full of aged wood and books. I stepped closer this time, more curious than cautious, and ran my fingers along the edge of the frame. Something clicked. A nearly imperceptible movement in the molding revealed a hidden hinge. My breath caught. I pressed more firmly. The painting tilted forward. Behind it was a small, built-in wall safe. For a long moment, I simply stared. My heart pounded with a rhythm that belonged to some earlier version of myself. A child who used to believe in secret doors and buried treasure. I reached forward and spun the dial, instinctively entering the numbers of my own birthday. Eleanor had always remembered that I was born first. The safe opened with a soft, deliberate click. Inside, I found a carefully arranged bundle of documents. At the top lay a sealed envelope marked for Ava. Beneath it, the unmistakable handwriting of my grandmother filled the pages of her personal journal. There were folders of bank statements, spreadsheets, scanned emails. And finally, a flash drive taped to the inside of the compartment with a note in Eleanor's script. "Give this to someone you trust." I sat down on the floor and opened the letter. "My dearest Ava, if you are reading this, then what I feared has come to pass. I have tried to confront Isla about her actions, but I believe she knows that I've uncovered the truth. I don't know how far she is willing to go to protect herself, but I fear it may cost me dearly. I want you to have this. Not just the documents, but the truth. You are the only one who sees beyond appearances. You are the one who understands what it means to protect a legacy not of wealth, but of integrity. Everything I have built belongs to you. Not because of birthright, but because of heart. Love always, Eleanor." I wept then, for the first time since her death. Not just for the loss, but for the burden. For the quiet, invisible war my grandmother had been fighting alone in her final days. For the betrayal that came not from strangers, but from within our own blood. That night, Grace arrived at the estate and immediately went to work. She examined the forged will side by side with documents I'd signed over the years. Letters, applications, even old birthday cards she had kept out of sentiment. "This is definitely your handwriting," she said without hesitation. "Not a close match. Not similar. Yours." Her certainty gave me a kind of sick validation. "If I take this to the court, will it hold?" I asked. "If we pair it with proof that Isla had access to your writing samples, and if we can show motive, there's a strong case for forgery," Grace said. "But it's going to take more than just handwriting to bring her down." That's where Lucian came in. By morning, he had already traced several of Isla's transactions from the Sterling Foundation, a nonprofit our grandmother had established to support rural education. The money trail led to shell companies in the Caymans, off-book transfers, and hidden accounts connected to Isla's personal banking network. "She's been siphoning funds for at least 3 years," he explained over coffee in the kitchen. "Small amounts at first, then larger. Classic laundering structure. And get this. Eleanor was about to go public with it. She had started drafting a financial disclosure the week before her death. Everything was aligning. The motive, the opportunity, the forged will. But the part that haunted me most wasn't the crime. It was that Eleanor had known. She had been preparing for this. And no one had listened. The next step was obvious, but terrifying. I drove back to Providence that afternoon and entered a quiet, gray building nestled between office towers, an FBI field office. With trembling hands, I handed over the flash drive and a copy of Eleanor's journal. I spoke to a financial crimes officer named Agent Holt, who listened intently as I explained everything, from the forged will to the safe behind the painting. By the end of our conversation, he promised me two things. One, that they would begin a formal investigation immediately, and two, that I should be careful. "Your sister," he said, "has a lot to lose. People with that kind of fear don't always make rational decisions." Back at the estate, I met with Mr. Carter in private. I presented him with the real will, dated 3 days before Eleanor's death, complete with her signature and his own initials scrawled in the margin from when she had asked him to prepare a final version. "I never saw this copy," he whispered, stunned. "She must have hidden it before I could file it." "We need to delay the estate transfer," I said. "I don't care what Isla is planning. She can't take this place. Not yet." "I'll file a motion to pause probate," he agreed. "We'll call it a procedural review. But Ava, you should know, if this goes public, it won't be quiet." "I don't need quiet," I said. "I need the truth." As night fell again, I walked alone into the library and stood before the now empty frame where the painting of roses had once hung. I had moved it to my car earlier that day, unsure if it might be tampered with. The wall looked bare without it, but I realized something unexpected. For the first time, the truth wasn't hidden. It was mine to carry, yes, but also mine to share. I looked around the room, remembering Eleanor's voice, her laughter, the lessons she had poured into me not through sermons or speeches, but through patience, quiet instruction, and trust. She had always said the roses would never fade, and now I understood why. They had been rooted not in canvas or paint, but in love, legacy, and the relentless pursuit of what was right. Tomorrow I would confront Isla, but tonight I let myself breathe. I wasn't just fighting to reclaim an inheritance. I was reclaiming a story that had almost been buried, and I wouldn't let it die with her. The morning light broke with a stillness that didn't feel like peace. It was the silence of breath held before a reckoning. I stood in the driveway of the Donovan estate with my fingers curled around the keys to my car, the weight of Eleanor's legacy in my coat pocket, and a decision behind my eyes that no longer trembled with doubt. Isla was already inside, of course. She had arrived back from Chicago the night before, earlier than expected. According to the house staff, she had spent the evening walking through each room like she was measuring the bones of the house, whispering instructions into her phone and making notes on her tablet. She had no idea what was coming. Not really. The final scene had been quietly set. I had called a small gathering in the library that morning, just immediate family and Mr. Carter, a few aunts, one uncle, enough to serve as both witness and audience. But hidden in the quiet folds of the gathering were two additional guests. Agent Holt from the FBI and his partner seated discreetly in the back, blending into the edges of the room like shadows waiting to move. I walked into the library with the painting of roses cradled in my arms. Isla looked up from her phone, clearly annoyed. "I thought we were done playing games, Ava." Her voice was too smooth, too rehearsed, but there was a flicker of unease when her eyes caught the frame in my hands. "We're just getting started," I said. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. "We're here today because Ava has asked to present new evidence regarding Eleanor Donovan's estate." Isla rolled her eyes. "This is absurd. We've already gone through this." "Actually," I said, setting the painting down, "we haven't." I turned to Mr. Carter and held out a file. Eleanor's real will, with his own initials scrawled in the margin, and the date clearly marked 3 days before her death. He took it with visible surprise, flipping through the pages slowly, each turn of the paper sharpening the silence in the room. This is my copy," he murmured. "She had me draft this a month ago, but I never received the signed version." "She left it in a safe behind this painting," I explained, resting my hand gently on the frame. "She wanted it protected. She knew someone would try to silence her." I moved across the room and placed a second folder on the table. This one held the documentation Grace had authenticated, samples of my handwriting compared to the forged will Isla had introduced. The similarities were undeniable. The curves, the loops, the angle of every signature stroke. She didn't just lie, I said, looking directly at my sister. She used my handwriting to forge a legal document. She used my identity to take what wasn't hers. Isla stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You have no proof I forged anything. You're right, I said calmly, but the FBI does. Agent Holt stood from the corner and stepped forward, holding up a warrant and a slim USB drive in a clear evidence bag. We've been investigating Ms. Isla Donovan for financial fraud and identity theft, he said. We now have evidence connecting her to illegal wire transfers from the Sterling Foundation, the forgery of a legal will, and the concealment of assets in offshore accounts. Gasps broke out across the room. Isla's face, for the first time in days, cracked. Her confidence faltered. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to the door, as if calculating the distance between herself and freedom. I'm sure this is a misunderstanding, she said quickly. I need to speak to my attorney. But Agent Holt was already reaching for the cuffs. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Ms. Donovan. She turned to me one last time as they led her away. Her voice was sharp, frantic. You think this makes you better? You think this makes you the real Donovan? I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because Eleanor already had. The room emptied slowly, relatives filing out in shock and silence. Mr. Carter remained, his hands trembling slightly as he returned the true will to his briefcase. She chose well, he said softly. Your grandmother. She always saw what others missed. I stood in the library long after everyone else had gone. The painting was back on the wall now, secured. But its meaning had changed. No longer a hiding place, no longer a shield. Now, it was a memorial, a quiet monument to the wisdom of a woman who had prepared for every possibility, even betrayal from her own blood. In the days that followed, the headlines exploded. The story was everywhere. Heiress arrested in fraud and forgery scandal. Donovan twin faces federal charges. Eleanor Donovan's legacy at risk. The reporters came and went, flashbulbs danced outside the estate gates, and Isla's perfect image unraveled in the public eye as quickly as it had risen. She was charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and obstruction. The investigation uncovered everything. Emails, bank statements, voice messages, even travel records that placed her in Eleanor's vicinity at suspicious times. There was no room left for doubt. And just like that, the lie crumbled. But justice, I would come to learn, was not a clean thing. It didn't arrive on a silver platter, dressed in clarity and closure. It came in pieces, in quiet, in rebuilding. 1 year later, I stood at the top of the garden steps, looking out over the grounds of the Donovan estate. The lawn was full of children, some with paintbrushes, others with pencils, their laughter echoing across the walls that had once held only solemnity. The West Wing had been transformed into a community art center, just as Eleanor would have wanted. The Eleanor Foundation had been resurrected, this time with full transparency, and its mission had expanded to fund arts education for underprivileged youth. Grace had taken on a permanent role as the director of programming. Lucian had published a powerful exposé on the case, not for drama, but to shed light on the dangers of unchecked power in philanthropic institutions. Even Agnes, our old housekeeper, had stayed. She now ran the estate kitchen, offering meals and mentorship to students who had never known a warm home-cooked dish. The roses in the garden bloomed more fiercely than I remembered. Their scent traveled on the breeze like memory-turned perfume. Inside the library, the portrait of Eleanor remained exactly where it had always been. I often sat beneath it in the late afternoons with a cup of tea and her journal in my lap. There were days when I still heard her voice in the turn of a page or saw her smile in the flicker of firelight. One evening, Mr. Carter visited again, bringing with him a donation check and a quiet smile. She'd be proud, he said, watching a group of girls sketching sunflowers in the courtyard. She taught me everything I know, I replied, touching the locket around my neck. The one she had given me on our last day together. The one with 2 tiny painted roses inside. He paused. Have you spoken to Isla? I shook my head. Some twins grow apart. Others were never truly connected. He didn't press further. Later that night, I returned to the library and opened Eleanor's journal to the last page. Beneath her final entry, I wrote a note in my own hand. Dear Grandma, justice was never a straight line. It cracked and trembled and took its time. But it came. The house is alive again. The roses still bloom. And your truth lives on in every lesson, every painting, every child who walks through these doors believing their story matters. Thank you for seeing me, for preparing me, even when I didn't understand. Thank you for believing in art, in truth, and in me. Your legacy isn't in what you left behind. It's in what you planted, and I promise to keep it growing. Love always, Ava. As I closed the book, the wind stirred the curtains. The sun was setting beyond the hills, casting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the heart of New England, behind the iron gates of a storied family estate, unfolded a tale not just of inheritance and betrayal, but of identity, justice, and the quiet power of resilience. Ava Donovan's journey is not the kind you'd see headlining tabloids or streaming in courtroom dramas. It's the kind of story that lives quietly in the corners of human experience. The one where someone chooses truth over comfort, integrity over revenge, and love over legacy. What began as the tragic death of her grandmother Eleanor quickly unraveled into a storm that stripped away every illusion Ava had about her family, her twin sister Isla, and the world she thought she knew. She stepped into the estate not just to mourn, but to witness. To watch her sister claim the role of rightful heir, brandishing a will Ava knew in her bones was not their grandmother's truth. She watched the house fill with hushed gossip and polite greed. She heard the language of wealth spoken like scripture: inheritance, assets, estates, while Eleanor's voice, her values, her legacy, threatened to be buried under the weight of deceit. But Ava didn't run. She didn't retreat, even as the walls around her seemed to collapse. Even as Isla wielded power with practiced ease, manipulating not just documents, but perceptions. Because Ava had something her sister didn't. She had history. She had memory. She had been listening during all those quiet Sunday teas when Eleanor passed down more than stories. She passed down intent. She remembered where the real will was hidden. She remembered what Eleanor said about the roses, how some art holds secrets, how legacy isn't always found in bank accounts or legal filings. And more importantly, Ava had the courage to go looking, to ask the hard questions, to trust her instincts even when the world told her she was being too sentimental, too naive. And in the process, she uncovered not just fraud and forgery, but the deeper rot: embezzlement, corruption, and the theft of something far more precious than money: truth. Through the discovery of the safe behind the painting, the handwritten will, the flash drive, and her grandmother's diary, Ava stitched together the fabric of a hidden war Eleanor had been fighting alone in her final days. And she didn't stop there. She brought in allies: Grace, who gave professional weight to the forged signature; Lucian, who uncovered the financial trail; and eventually the FBI, who gave force to the truth Eleanor and Ava had protected in silence. In the final confrontation, as Isla's empire crumbled and handcuffs replaced her designer jewelry, Ava didn't gloat. She didn't revel in the spectacle of her sister's downfall. Because this wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about preserving what mattered most: the integrity of a woman who had lived a life of substance, of principle, and of quiet, intentional power. And perhaps that is the most profound aspect of this story. Because in a world obsessed with noise, Ava chose stillness. In a world built on appearances, she chose truth. In a world that often equates power with domination, she chose restoration. She didn't just win back what was rightfully hers. She reimagined it. Ava didn't keep the estate locked away like a monument to pain. She opened it. She filled it with children, with artists, with stories, with the very breath of life that Eleanor had believed in. The West Wing became a center for art and education. The Eleanor Foundation was reborn, this time transparent, inclusive, and alive. And the roses? They bloomed more beautifully than ever, not just on canvas, but in community. That, right there, is what legacy really is. Not the wealth left behind, but the values carried forward. And Ava? She carried them with grace, with purpose, and with a strength forged not in rage, but in love. This story also reminds us that family, for all its beauty, can also be a battlefield. That not all ties that bind are sacred. That sometimes the person who shares your blood can be the very person who tries to erase your voice. But it also teaches us that the past, when preserved with care, can speak louder than any lie. That the wisdom of those who came before us, when held and honored, can become our armor in moments of betrayal. So, what do we take from Ava Donovan's journey? What does her story mean for those of us living lives perhaps far from estates and legal battles, but still navigating truth and trust every single day? The lesson is this: truth needs a guardian, not a loud one, not an aggressive one, but a consistent one. Someone who remembers the details, someone who holds the line when others waver, someone who, even in the face of overwhelming pressure, says, "No, that's not how the story ends." In every family, in every community, in every workplace, there are truths waiting to be protected, legacies waiting to be honored, even if no one else sees them. Ava didn't wait for permission. She didn't need a platform or a spotlight. She started with what she had: a memory, a letter, a painting, a gut feeling. And she built her case piece by piece from the quiet courage to believe that right matters, even when it seems like wrong is winning. You don't need to be wealthy to protect a legacy. You don't need a law degree to challenge injustice. You just need the willingness to pay attention, to listen, to preserve. And sometimes, yes, to fight. But fighting doesn't always mean fire. Sometimes it means roots. It means blooming in defiance of darkness. It means letting the truth, like Eleanor's roses, find its way back to the light. And if you've ever been made to feel like your quiet voice doesn't count, if you've ever been told you're too soft, too sentimental, too idealistic, remember Ava Donovan. Remember that the one who was underestimated, the one who was overlooked, was the one who carried the truth all along. So, take heart. Let this story be a reminder that the world may sometimes reward the loudest, the flashiest, the fastest. But it remembers the honest. It honors the ones who keep going, even when the odds are against them. It eventually bows to the ones who choose to rebuild rather than destroy. In the end, Ava didn't just get justice for herself. She gave justice a home. And in doing so, she taught us all that when everything else fades, the truth, if tended with love, will never wither. It blooms, it endures, it leads us forward. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, if it reminded you of someone you know, or someone you are, then we invite you to stay with us. Because stories like Ava's aren't just fiction. They are echoes of real strength, real heartbreak, real beauty. There are more stories like this to come, and we want you with us on this journey. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to support the stories that deserve to be told. Stories of quiet heroes, of justice rising, of legacy reclaimed. And with your support, we'll keep creating more content that moves hearts, opens eyes, and inspires courage in the everyday. Until next time, stay true, and never underestimate the power of a single rose in bloom.